The linen was white. Impossibly white. A field of fresh snow under the low, golden light of the restaurant chandelier. Victor Koslov always noticed the linen first. It was a measure of a place. A clean, pressed tablecloth told you everything you needed to know about standards. About discipline. And this place, his place, had the highest standards. He sat at his usual table in the back corner. The one with a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen doors. It was a table of quiet power, shrouded in a pocket of respectful silence that other patrons knew better than to breach. His two dinner companions, men of substantial but lesser means, had just departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive cologne and satisfied ambition. A deal had been struck. A territory realigned. Words had been spoken with the weight of iron, and handshakes had sealed pacts that no court of law would ever recognize. It was business. It was his world. Victor signaled for an espresso. He did not need to raise his hand high. A simple, almost imperceptible lift of his index finger was enough. The maître d', a man named Julian who had worked this floor for 20 years, saw it instantly and nodded. That was the other thing about this place. The staff were professionals. They were ghosts, anticipating needs before they were fully formed, moving with silent efficiency. They knew the rules. Everyone who entered Victor's orbit learned the rules. They were simple. Unyielding. Loyalty was rewarded. Betrayal was erased. And his private time was to be respected above all else. The girl was new. He had noticed her before. Perhaps for a month. Young, with tired eyes that she tried to hide behind a practiced, weary smile. She moved with a nervous energy the other staff lacked, a constant low-level tremor of anxiety. She was a fawn in a forest of wolves, and she knew it. Her name was Ilara, he'd heard another waitress call her that. She was not the one who usually served his table. Julian ensured Victor was attended to by only the most senior, most invisible staff. But tonight, she was the one who approached. She walked toward his table, a small silver tray in her hand to clear the remnants of his meeting. Her steps were hesitant. A breach of protocol. Julian was already moving from his post near the entrance, his expression a mask of polite panic. Marco, Victor's man, who stood like a statue near the wall, shifted his weight. A subtle ripple of warning. The girl, Ilara, seemed to shrink under the sudden weight of their attention. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the water glasses and the folded napkins left behind. She was breaking a rule, and she was terrified. But she kept coming. Victor watched her, his face impassive. He was curious. Fear was the currency of his world, and he knew all its denominations. This was not the fear of a subordinate who had made a mistake. This was something else. This was the fear of the cornered. The desperate. She reached the table. Her hands trembled as she picked up a glass. Her knuckles were white. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marco took a half-step forward. Victor raised his hand. A single, placid motion. "Stop." Marco froze. Julian halted his advance, hovering uselessly by a neighboring table. The quiet pocket of the restaurant became taut, the silence stretching thin like a drum skin. The girl worked quickly, her movements jerky. She gathered the plates, her gaze never once lifting to meet Victor's. Her focus was entirely on the task, as if clearing the table was the most important thing in the world. As if her life depended on it. Victor's coat, a heavy thing of black wool, was draped over the empty chair beside him. As she reached for the last bread plate, her body brushed against the chair. It was a small, clumsy movement. An accident. Or it was designed to look like one. Her hand, for a fleeting second, disappeared into the fold of his coat. It was a movement so swift, so practiced in its seeming awkwardness, that anyone else would have missed it. But Victor missed nothing. He felt the faint whisper of fabric, saw the barest flicker of her fingers near his pocket. And then it was done. She straightened up, the tray now full. She still didn't look at him. "I will bring your espresso, sir," she mumbled, and then she turned and walked away, a soldier retreating from a minefield. Victor remained perfectly still. He watched her go, a straight back held rigid with terror. He could feel the new weight in his pocket. It was small, but it felt as heavy as an anchor. A foreign object in his meticulously controlled world. He waited a full minute, his gaze distant. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around the object. It was a set of keys. A single, cheap-looking house key and a car key on a plain metal ring. Wrapped around them was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. A note. This was more than a breach of protocol. This was an invitation to chaos. An act of utter, insane desperation. And for the first time in a very long time, Victor Koslov did not know what was going to happen next. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will redefine the line between a monster and a protector. It's a story you won't want to miss. If you're enjoying this story, I'd be honored if you'd give this video a like and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what we have coming. And I love to see how far these stories travel, so please, drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. Now, let's get back to it. Victor did not open the note. Not yet. He held the keys in his palm, their cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the restaurant. He felt the sharp edges. The cheap, flimsy feel of the key ring. This was the hardware of a simple life. A life lived far from the gilded cage he occupied. He looked across the dining room. Ilara was at her station by the kitchen, refilling salt shakers. Her hands were still trembling. He could see it even from this distance. She was trying to appear normal, to blend back into the background, but she was a beacon of fear. Every few seconds, her eyes would dart towards his table, a quick, terrified glance, before snapping back to her work. She was waiting. Waiting for the explosion. For the 250-pound man by the wall to cross the room and drag her out into the alley. For the polite maître d' to inform her that her services were no longer required, effective immediately. For the world to come crashing down. But the explosion did not come. Victor simply sat there, the keys concealed in his hand, and watched. Who was this girl? She was a nobody. A face in the crowd of people who served him, who feared him, who existed on the periphery of his life. But her desperate act had pierced the veil. She had reached through the layers of power and reputation and placed her life, quite literally, in his hands. Victor was a man of rules. His empire, built from the rubble of his own broken youth, was founded on a rigid code. It was a brutal code, but it was a code nonetheless. It governed everything. Deals were honored. Debts were paid. Family was protected. And the innocent, the civilians who lived their lives outside his violent world, were to be left alone. They were not pawns. They were not targets. They were not to be touched. This was his most sacred rule. A line drawn in blood, separating his world from theirs. To harm a civilian, especially a woman or a child, was not just bad for business. It was a violation. A sin that he did not tolerate in his men, and certainly not in his enemies. He had seen what happened when that line was crossed. He had seen it as a boy. The memory came unbidden, as it often did in quiet moments. A cramped, cold apartment that always smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. His mother, her face thin and pale, her hands raw from scrubbing other people's floors. He remembered the landlord. A fat, sweating man with a cruel smile and wandering hands. He remembered the fear in his mother's eyes, the same fear he now saw in the waitress. The fear of a woman with no power, trapped by a man who had all of it. Victor had been 10 years old. He had stood in the doorway, a small, helpless witness. He had done nothing. He could do nothing. That night, he had made a promise to himself. A silent, burning vow in the dark. Never again. Never again would he be helpless. Never again would he stand by and watch the strong prey on the weak. He had spent the next 40 years of his life accumulating power, building walls of money and fear around himself, all to honor the vow of a powerless little boy. And now, this girl. This waitress with the trembling hands had, without knowing it, reached into his past and gripped the heart of that 10-year-old boy. He signaled for Marco. His lieutenant was at his side in an instant, bending low to hear his master's quiet command. "The girl," Victor said, his voice a low rumble. "The new one. Ilara. Find out everything." Marco nodded once. He did not ask why. He did not question the order. He simply melted away, pulling out his phone as he moved towards the back of the house. Information was another currency, and Marco was a master of acquiring it. While he waited, Victor finally unfolded the note. The paper was cheap, torn from a server's notepad. The writing was a frantic scrawl, the ink smudged in places as if by tears. It was only a few words. "He's coming tonight. My apartment. He has a key. Please." Below the words was an address. An apartment in a run-down part of the city, miles away from the polished mahogany and starched linen of this restaurant. And below the address, a single, heartbreaking word. "Help." Victor folded the paper and placed it back in his pocket with the keys. He looked at the girl again. She was watching him openly now, her pretense of working forgotten. Her face was a canvas of raw terror and desperate hope. She had thrown her Hail Mary. She had slipped her keys into the pocket of the most dangerous man in the city, praying he was a savior and not just another monster. What did she know of him? Only the rumors. The whispers among the staff. That he was a gangster. A killer. A man who owned judges and politicians and half the businesses in this district. Why would she turn to him? Because the system had failed her. That was the only possible answer. The police, the courts, the people who were supposed to protect the innocent, they had failed her. When the system failed, people turned to men like him. Men who operated outside the law, who delivered their own, more immediate, form of justice. He was the court of last resort. Marco returned. He stood by the table, his face impassive as always, but his eyes held a flicker of something. Disgust. "Her name is Ilara Vance," Marco began, his voice low. 22 years old. Works here 5 nights a week, works at a diner for the morning shift. She has a younger brother, Liam. He's 16. He has cystic fibrosis. The medical bills, they're astronomical. She's been taking care of him on her own since their parents died 2 years ago. Victor listened, his expression unchanging, but inside, the story resonated with the echoes of his own past. The struggle. The desperation to keep a family afloat. She got behind, Marco continued. The brother had a bad turn last month. A hospital stay. She needed money fast. She didn't go to a bank. She went to a loan shark. Victor's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Vultures who circled the desperate, offering quick cash at impossible rates. "Who is it?" Victor asked. "A man named Silas Croft," Marco said. The name was delivered with contempt. A bottom feeder. Not part of any real organization. He's a parasite who preys on people like her. The initial loan was $5,000. With his interest, she now owes him $30,000. She missed a payment this week. Marco paused. Silas has a reputation. When the women can't pay with cash, he collects in other ways. He's known for it. He likes to make them feel powerless. He told her he was coming tonight to collect his first down payment. There it was. The picture, complete and ugly. The fat, sweating landlord from his memory now had a name. Silas Croft. Victor looked at the keys in his hand. He looked at the girl across the room, who was now crying silently, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand so no one would see. The world was full of monsters. The internal conflict was brief, but sharp. A part of him, the cold, calculating businessman, whispered that this was not his fight. It was a foolish risk. A distraction. Getting involved in the messy life of a waitress was beneath him. It was a complication he did not need. His world was one of order, and this was chaos. He could throw the keys on the table and leave. He could have Marco give the girl a stack of cash, enough to pay off her debt and disappear. A clean, simple solution. A transaction. But his heart, the part that still remembered the cold floor of that apartment and the shame of his own helplessness, rebelled. This wasn't about money. This was about a line being crossed. A predator targeting the weak. It was about the rule. His rule. Giving her money would solve the problem for tonight. But it would not stop men like Silas Croft. It would not enforce the code. It would not deliver justice. It would only be a bandage on a festering wound. And Victor Koslov did not use bandages. He performed surgery. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, but it commanded the attention of the entire room. The low hum of conversation faltered. Diners looked up from their plates. The staff froze. He looked at Marco. "Clear the restaurant," he said. The command was quiet, but it carried the force of a thunderclap. Marco's eyes widened slightly. This was unprecedented. "So? Everyone out," Victor repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Pay their bills. Apologize for the inconvenience. Tell them there is a gas leak. I don't care what you tell them. But this room will be empty in 5 minutes." He then turned his gaze to Julian, the maître d', who looked as if he might faint. "Julian. Lock the doors after they are gone. No one else comes in. No 1 inch." Julian could only nod, his mouth agape. Victor then made a call. He spoke in Russian, his words short and clipped. It was a call to the men who handled his security, his enforcers. The men who did the work that couldn't be done with handshakes. "I need a team. An address. I'll send it to you. We are handling a sanitation problem." He hung up. The choice was made. He had crossed the line from observer to participant. He was breaking his own rules about non-involvement, but he was doing it to enforce a more important one. He was going to step into this girl's life. He was going to stand in her small, cheap apartment and he was going to wait for the monster to arrive. And he was going to show him what a real monster looked like. The restaurant emptied with a surreal, controlled swiftness. Marco and Julian moved through the room, speaking in low, apologetic tones. There were murmurs of confusion, but no one argued. When a man like Victor Koslov wanted a room cleared, you did not ask questions. You simply left. Within 10 minutes, the vast dining room was silent and empty. The clatter of cutlery and the murmur of conversation were replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. The only people left were Victor, Marco, and the girl, Ilara, who stood by the service station, looking small and lost in the cavernous space. Victor walked towards her. She flinched as he approached, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She thought she was the reason for this. She thought she was in trouble. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her eyes. He saw the faint bruise on her wrist, peeking out from the cuff of her uniform, that he suspected had not come from a kitchen accident. He saw the fierce, desperate pride that was holding her together. He held out his hand, palm up. In it were her keys. She stared at them, then at his face. Her brow furrowed. "You have a guest coming to your apartment tonight," Victor said. His voice was not unkind. It was a simple statement of fact. Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. "I will be there to greet him," he continued. "My men and I. We will wait for him. You will not go home tonight. You will stay here. Marco will stay with you. You will be safe." The reality of what he was saying slowly dawned on her. This wasn't a punishment. This was an answer. An impossible answer to an impossible prayer. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, ragged sound of pure relief. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. "Why?" she whispered through her fingers. "You don't know me. Why would you do this?" Victor looked at her, and for a moment, he wasn't seeing a 22-year-old waitress. He was seeing his mother. He was seeing every woman who had ever been backed into a corner by a man who thought his strength gave him the right to be cruel. "Men like him," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "should not exist in my city. It is a matter of professional standards." He turned to Marco. "Stay with her. Get her something to eat. See that she is comfortable. No one bothers her. Understood?" "Understood, boss," Marco said, his expression one of deep respect. Victor walked out of the silent restaurant and into the cool night air. His car, a sleek black sedan that was as much an armored vehicle as it was a luxury car, was waiting at the curb. His men were already there, 2 more cars pulling up behind his. They were shadows in dark suits, their faces grim and professional. He gave them the address. The drive to Ilara's apartment was quiet. Victor stared out the window at the city lights blurring past. He was moving from his world of calculated risks and corporate fronts into the messy, unpredictable world of street-level thuggery. It felt like a step down, but also a step back to something more fundamental. The apartment building was exactly as he had pictured it. A tired, 5-story brick box in a neighborhood that had been forgotten by the city's progress. The lobby smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. They took the stairs. No noise. No fuss. He used Ilara's key to open the door to her apartment. It was number 4B. The apartment was small. A living room, a tiny kitchen, and a hallway that led to what he assumed were 2 small bedrooms. But it was clean. Meticulously clean. There were signs of a life here, a struggle, but also of love. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator. A stack of worn paperbacks sat on a small bookshelf. On a little end table was a framed photograph of Ilara and a smiling, pale-faced boy. Her brother, Liam. This was what she was fighting for. This tiny, fragile world. Victor walked through the small space. He ran a hand over the worn fabric of the sofa. He felt like an intruder, a bear in a dollhouse. His presence, and that of his men, felt like a desecration of this simple, honest place. But they were a necessary evil. A shield against a worse one. "Turn off the lights," he commanded quietly. 2 of you in the kitchen. 2 of you in the hall. "You," he said to one of his largest men, a man named Dmitri, "stand behind the door. He won't see you when he enters." His men moved into position, disappearing into the shadows. They were professionals. They knew how to wait. Victor sat down in a small, slightly lumpy armchair that faced the door. He sat in the darkness, the only light coming from the streetlights filtering through the thin curtains. And he waited. The silence in the apartment was absolute. It was the silence of a predator in ambush. Victor's senses were heightened. He heard the hum of the old refrigerator. The distant wail of a siren. The creak of the building as it settled. An hour passed. Then another. Victor was patient. He had learned patience as a boy, hiding from his father's drunken rages. He had perfected it in boardrooms and back alleys. He could outwait any man. Finally, just after midnight, he heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy, confident steps. The sound of a key sliding into the lock. The door clicked open. A man stepped inside. He was large, with a fleshy face and a cheap leather jacket that strained at the seams. He had the arrogant swagger of a man who was used to taking what he wanted. This was Silas Croft. He closed the door behind him, plunging the room back into near darkness. He didn't bother to turn on the light. He probably enjoyed the fear that the darkness brought. "Ilara, baby," he called out, his voice a greasy sneer. "Daddy's here to collect. I hope you're ready to pay your bill." He took a step into the living room. And then the lights flashed on. Silas Croft froze, his eyes blinking in the sudden, harsh glare. He saw Victor sitting in the armchair, perfectly calm, his hands resting on his knees. He saw the other men emerge from the shadows, surrounding him. Large, silent men whose faces promised nothing but pain. The swagger evaporated. The arrogant sneer on his face curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly morphed into terror. "Who the hell are you?" he stammered, his voice cracking. Victor didn't answer immediately. He just watched him, letting the fear build. He let Silas's mind race, trying to understand the impossible situation he had walked into. "You are in the wrong house," Victor said finally, his voice calm and cold as a river stone. "This is Ilara Vance's place," Silas blustered, trying to regain a sliver of his bravado. "I have business with her." "No," Victor corrected him. "You had business with her. That business is now concluded." One of Victor's men stepped forward and handed him a sheaf of papers. It was the loan agreement Marco had procured a copy of. Victor held it up for Silas to see. "This document," Victor said, "is a work of fiction. The interest rate is an insult to the laws of mathematics and decency. You lent a desperate girl $5,000. You intended to ruin her life for it. That's my business." Silas squealed, his voice rising in panic. "You have no right." "Right." Victor mused, a dangerous calm settling over him. He stood up slowly. He was not as large as Silas, but he moved with a coiled energy that made him seem twice as big. "Let me tell you about rights, Mr. Croft. This girl you have been terrorizing works 2 jobs. She works 18 hours a day. She does this to pay for medicine for her sick brother, a 16-year-old boy who is fighting just to breathe. She is what is good in this world. She is a person of honor." He took a step closer to Silas, who tried to back away but found his path blocked by the mountain of a man named Dmitri. "You," Victor continued, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, "are a parasite. You feed on the desperation of good people. You have no honor. You are a rat in the walls of my city. And I am the exterminator." He held up the loan agreement. "Her debt is paid," he said. Then, with a deliberate tear, he ripped the papers in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. Silas's face was slick with sweat. He looked from Victor to the other men, his eyes begging for an escape that did not exist. "You can't do this," he whimpered. "Do you know who I am?" Victor almost smiled. The question was pathetic. It was the last resort of a weak man trying to pretend he was strong. "I know exactly what you are," Victor said. "And what you are is finished. Your business is closed. Your operations in my city are over. You will never contact Miss Vance again. You will never go near her or her brother again. In fact, you will not be bothering anyone. Ever again." The finality in his tone was absolute. It was not a threat. It was a judgment. Victor turned his back on him, a sign of ultimate dismissal. He walked towards the door. "Take out the trash," he said to his men over his shoulder. He did not look back as Dmitri and the others moved in on Silas Croft. He did not need to. He heard a muffled cry, a short, violent struggle, and then silence. The problem was solved. The line was redrawn. The rule was enforced. Victor stepped out of the apartment and into the hallway, leaving the darkness behind him. He took a deep breath of the stale air. He felt no pleasure in the violence. Only a grim sense of satisfaction. A sense of order restored. He returned to the restaurant. It was just as he had left it, empty and silent. The only light came from a single lamp near the bar, casting long shadows across the room. Ilara was sitting at a small table, a plate of untouched food in front of her. Marco stood a respectful distance away. She looked up as Victor entered, her eyes huge and questioning. She stood up, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. He walked over to her table and placed her keys down on the white linen tablecloth. They made a small, definitive clink in the quiet room. "It's over," he said simply. "He will not be back." The tension drained from her face, replaced by a wave of relief so profound it seemed to make her knees buckle. She sank back into her chair. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but these were not tears of fear. They were tears of release. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know how I can ever repay you." She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled wad of bills. It couldn't have been more than $50. Her life savings, probably. She held it out to him, a desperate, honorable gesture. "Please," she said. "It's all I have, but please take it." Victor looked at the money in her hand, then at her tear-streaked face. He gently pushed her hand back down. "Keep your money, Ilara," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You owe me nothing." "But I have to give you something," she insisted. "You already have," he said. She looked at him, confused. "What? What did I give you?" He paused, considering the question. What had she given him? A problem. A risk. A distraction. And something else. Something he hadn't realized he'd lost. A reminder, he said, more to himself than to her. A reminder of what is important. He thought of the photo of her and her brother. Of her clean, small apartment. Of her courage. She had reminded him of the world he had once fought to escape and now fought to protect. She stared at him, this powerful, terrifying man who had descended into her life like a storm and left clear skies in his wake. The whispers and rumors about him painted a picture of a monster. But what he had done for her, it was not monstrous. It was heroic. "Are you a bad man?" she asked, the question soft and genuine. It was a child's question. A question about good and evil, black and white. Victor's world was a universe of grey. He had done monstrous things to build his empire. He had hurt people. He had broken laws and lives. But he had also created order. He had protected his own. He had operated by a code in a world that often had none. He considered his answer carefully. "I am what is necessary," he said finally. "Tonight, for you, that was enough." He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. It was thick white cardstock, with nothing on it but a single phone number, embossed in black ink. No name. No company. He placed it on the table next to her keys. "This number," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "If you or your brother ever need anything. Anything at all. A doctor. A school. A job. If anyone ever troubles you again. You call this number. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with the magnitude of his offer. It was more than a phone number. It was a shield. A promise of lifelong protection. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling utterly inadequate. Victor simply nodded. He turned and walked away, his business there concluded. Marco fell into step behind him. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at the girl, a small figure in a vast, empty room, clutching a set of keys and a business card as if they were the most precious jewels in the world. For a moment, he felt the ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was a foreign, unfamiliar feeling. Then he stepped out into the night, leaving her to the safety of her new beginning. 5 years passed. The city changed, as cities do. Buildings rose and fell. New faces of power emerged, and old ones faded. But through it all, Victor Koslov's position remained unchanged. He was a constant, an immovable object in the shifting landscape of the underworld. His empire grew, his influence deepened, but the man himself remained the same. Quiet. Disciplined. A king on a throne of shadows. His office was on the top floor of a skyscraper that bore a legitimate corporate name. It was a space of minimalist elegance. Black marble, dark wood, and a wall of glass that overlooked the entire city. It was the view of a man who owned what he surveyed. The office was meticulously organized. Every file, every book, every object had its place. It was a reflection of his mind. Orderly. Controlled. But on his vast, uncluttered desk of polished mahogany, amidst the papers detailing shipping manifests and financial reports, sat a single, small object that did not belong. It was a simple, silver picture frame. Inside the frame was not a picture of a wife or a child. Victor had neither. It was a photograph that had arrived in the mail a few months prior, sent to a post office box he maintained for just such anonymous communications. The photo was of a young man in a dark blue graduation gown and cap, a university diploma clutched in his hand. He was smiling, a bright, healthy, confident smile. His arm was around a young woman who was beaming with a pride so fierce it practically radiated from the image. It was Liam and Ilara Vance. There was no note included with the photograph. None was needed. The picture was the message. It spoke of medical bills that were no longer a concern. Of a prestigious university education that had been mysteriously funded by an anonymous scholarship. Of a life saved and a future secured. It spoke of a promise kept. Victor looked at that photograph every day. It was a grounding presence in a world of abstractions and violence. It was a reminder. Ilara had gone on to finish nursing school. She now worked in the pediatric wing of the best hospital in the city, a position she had more than earned with her skill and compassion. She had never called the number on the card again. She had not needed to. She had taken the chance she was given and built a life of her own, a life of healing and peace. She was a success story written in the ink of one dark night. Marco entered the office, placing a report on the corner of the desk. He saw Victor looking at the photograph. He had seen him do it 1,000 times. "Good kids," Marco said quietly. It was the only time he had ever commented on it. Victor nodded, his gaze still on the smiling faces. "The best," he said. He had made countless deals in his life, transactions involving millions of dollars and the fates of powerful men. But the single most valuable acquisition he had ever made was not a company or a territory. It was this small, cheap photograph. It was a receipt for a debt that had been paid not with money, but with something far more precious. It was proof that sometimes, even in the darkest of worlds, a little bit of light could be protected. True strength is not just the power to destroy. It is the wisdom to know what to protect. In a world full of monsters who prey on the vulnerable, sometimes the only shield is a different kind of monster, one who operates by an older, more honorable code. A single act of desperate courage can be a key, unlocking the humanity hidden in the most hardened heart and proving that a man is not defined by the darkness he walks in, but by the people he chooses to lead into the light.